Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. It's your host, Nick Giordano. Now, make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Follow me on social media at P.A.S. Report and share this episode with 3 to 4 other people that you know. I know there's a lot going on with the anti-ICE riots taking place, and I spoke a little bit about it last week when I focused on Minneapolis and what's going on. Obviously, that story isn't going away. I will be covering it more. But for today, I want to talk about what's going on in Iran, because I don't think people understand or appreciate why Iran is so important. And we have to analyze the current situation through a prism of realism, not liberalism, right? We have to look at the situation of what is happening now, not the way we want it to happen, not the way we want it to work out. Because right now, we have a few dangerous tendencies that are currently competing with each other. On one side here in America, there are those that already believe that the regime is finished, that its collapse is imminent. The Ayatollah and his regime are in the final chapter, and I really hope that's the case. I would love to see nothing more than the Ayatollah fall, but that's the type of wish casting that's gotten us into a lot of trouble many times before. You know, our so-called foreign policy experts have gotten it wrong time and time again because of the false assumptions that they always make, and we can't fall into that trap again. On another side, you have this really bizarre situation going on. I am seeing so many posts where people believe that the protests are not really happening, right? Or that they're happening. However, it's America and Israel that are behind these protests. They're behind the unrest. Now, it's not that America has never participated in color revolutions before. We have plenty of times, in maybe seeing one going on in the United States. Most times, these color revolutions that we create in other countries, they don't really work out the way we anticipate. But that's not what's happening in this case. First of all, when it comes to Iran, we've seen mass protests before. Some lasted days, others lasted a few weeks. Many of them ultimately end up turning deadly. And the truth is, the Iranian people are tired of their government. Their government is deeply unpopular. 2/3 of the Iranian people are of a younger generation. They want closer ties with the West. The Iranian economic situation has become extraordinarily desperate for the families in Iran. And what we're seeing today, it's even worse than the lead up to the Shah's eventual collapse. But the other reason I don't believe it's a color revolution is because Iran is an extremely difficult country to penetrate. The regime's security apparatus is built on a foundation that is steeped in deep-seated paranoia. I mean, you have multiple overlapping intelligence agencies, the Ministry of Intelligence, the IRGC's intelligence components, and they spend much of their time watching each other, as they do watching the population. This isn't just about a secret police force. This is a multi-layered fortress of internal surveillance that's designed specifically to prevent the foreign-led infiltration that leads to espionage. Now, the other strange aspect to this, and this one is driving me nuts, I've seen a number of people, not only are they accusing America and the Jews for being behind the unrest, but they're actively defending the Ayatollah and his regime as if this theocratic dictatorship is some kind of noble vanguard against globalism. They want to ignore how the regime hangs its own people from construction cranes for the crime of wanting a better life, essentially. They ignore that. Then you have another group here in the United States, and there's nothing but silence. You know, thousands of innocent Iranians have been killed. Estimates are all over the map. They're as low as 2,000. Others reported to be over 20,000. And you have to understand, getting confirmation is nearly impossible when we have situations like this. We have no idea what an accurate number is. The one certainty that we do know is that this regime has no problem killing anyone they view as a threat to their power. So we know mass deaths are occurring. We know the repression that's taking place. We know the torture and the death. Where are all the activists? Where are the pro-Palestinian mobs? Where are the NGOs? Where's the media? They've all gone mute. No mass demonstrations, no college campus protests, no student walkouts, no free Iran chants. It's just radio silence. And the reason that I want to point that out, because that's not a focus of this episode, but I do want to point that out because they demonstrate what selective outrage looks like in real time. Now, obviously, when you have these situations going on, it's difficult to get accurate information, and the Iranian regime tightly controls the flow of information. They've shut down their internet. We're seeing suppression take place. Families are threatened into silence. So any information that's coming out of Iran, there's not that much confirmation. What we do know is that the regime is responding with extraordinary brutality. We have reports, some corroborated, some impossible to verify, but we do have reports of Iranian officials even entering hospitals, killing wounded protesters, and anyone that they suspect is involved in the demonstrations in any sort of way. And to be responsible, I'll say this clearly, not every video or report can be confirmed in real time, but the key point, and this is the critical key point, this is a regime with a long documented history of mass murder, torture, and extrajudicial killings. This is not out of character for them. This is not a sudden deviation. This is how the Islamic Republic survives. So when I hear reports of extreme violence, the presumption should not be disbelief. It should be, yeah, that's probably the grim plausibility of what's actually happening. And we have clear asymmetry here, right? On one side, you have unarmed civilians, students, workers, women, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, people demanding dignity, people demanding an end to the repression, people that want a better life. On the other side, you have this fanatical regime. You have armed security forces. You have a very capable Islamic Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps that has no regard for dissent, that sees compromise as a betrayal to the Ayatollah and will not hesitate to eliminate threats. Most important is the system that views the murder of its own people is a legitimate tool of governance. So that imbalance matters. We have to look at the courage of the Iranian people. And while there's so many in the United States that believe this may be the end of the Iranian regime, the truth is that courage is real, but so is fear. So is exhaustion. So is the psychological toll of watching people disappear, get tortured or killed, friends, family members. And the regime understands that. As a matter of fact, the regime is actually counting on that. See, the Ayatollah's strategy, it's not to persuade his population. It's not to compromise and give in to some of the demands of the people, to hear their grievances. His strategy is a strategy of attrition. He knows. The Ayatollah is well aware, the IRGC is well aware, that he can wear the protesters down. And the more that the people of Iran are in prison, the more they're tortured, the more they're killed, sooner or later the protests are going to begin to dissipate. Sooner or later, the protesters will begin to lose hope. And that's what he's banking on. So this is where I want to bring in some personal context to the story. And it's not to make it about me, but to explain why I find what's going on in Iran so important, why I'm cautious about easy conclusions, the oversimplification, but why I have an interest in this area is because I did my master's thesis back in 2006 on the ingredients that give rise to revolutions, and I used Iran as my primary case study. I examined why the Shah collapsed, how revolutionary conditions form, what separates a protest movement from actual regime change. And the paper also analyzed whether or not the ingredients existed for a new Iranian revolution. Again, this was in 2006, but here we are, Iran today, 2026, and they exhibit nearly every structural condition necessary for government collapse. There's economic decay going on. You have demographic pressures with 2/3 of the generation being from a younger generation. You have the loss of legitimacy when it comes to the government. People are tired of the ideology of the Ayatollah, a population that no longer believes the system is going to reform itself, a population that is now hopeless. All of that is there. But understand, revolutions don't happen just because conditions are ripe. They happen when specific ingredients begin to fall into place. Revolutions don't just succeed because people are brave. I mean, the Iranian people are showing tremendous courage, and it adds to the enormous pressure on the decaying institutions within Iran. But governments only collapse when the vanguards and the elites decide that the regime is no longer worth saving. Now, we're seeing reports of desertions amongst lower-level members of Iran's security forces, and that matters. But we have to interpret it correctly. Lower-level desertions is nothing more than a stress signal. It tells us that the system's under strain. But collapse begins somewhere else. Collapse begins when you start seeing senior commanders defect. So if we start hearing senior commanders of the IRGC are defecting, that's important. Pay attention to that. When you have powerful clerics start breaking ranks with the Ayatollah, when political insiders choose survival over loyalty, when the elites begin to move their assets and their families out of the country. And as of now, I know we want to be optimistic in this situation, but as of now, however much people want to believe it to be otherwise, we are not there yet. We started to see money being transferred out of the country, but I am unaware of mass high-level defections. And this is a fluid situation. So I am simply talking about, as of this recording, by the time this airs, the situation may have changed. We have the ingredients for revolution. They do exist in Iran, but there's still two ingredients that are missing. One is a unified opposition structure. Not all factions within Iran are on the same page, and that is important to note. Second, there is a lack of unified on-the-ground coordinating authority. People are pointing here in the United States to Reza Pahlavi, the son of the late Shah. He wants to create a transitional effort toward a secular democracy in Iran that's aligned with Western ideals, and he seems really sincere in his desires for a free Iran. But the realist in me tells me that we have to look at the facts. Reza Pahlavi has been out of the country for nearly 5 decades, and while some in Washington, you have the Senator Lindsey Grahams of the world who never saw a war you didn't like, that's for sure. They're quick to anoint Reza Pahlavi as the face of the movement, and what we have to ask is if that sentiment is shared amongst the Gen Zers, the Iranian Gen Zers, who are currently facing down the IRGC in the streets. And I don't have an answer to that. Does Reza Pahlavi have the street credibility within Iran? And we have to also understand the historical memory of the final days of the Shah, the historical memory of the Savak, the secret police force, the old monarchy. That still lingers for the older generations within Iran. The Shah's brutality may not compare to the current brutality of the mullahs. The political landscape is far more complicated, and we have too many Americans here in the United States that want to oversimplify this. My point isn't to dismiss Pahlavi. It's to warn against the green room fallacy, where we assume the person that's most comfortable talking to Western media is the same person the Iranian people are ready to follow into a revolution. We have to be honest about that. And the bottom line is this. You can have millions of people in the street, but if the guy in charge of the tank still thinks his best bet for survival is staying loyal to the Ayatollah, the probability of success isn't great. See, real change happens when the man with the tank realizes that the regime is dying, that it's a sinking ship, and that supporting the regime comes with consequences, and it ensures their own demise. That's when the survival instinct kicks in, and that's when the regime is cooked. Now, some of you are probably asking yourselves, 12 minutes going on and on, why, as an American, should you care about what happens in Iran? That's a legitimate question, and that's a question I want to tackle in the next segment. So stay tuned. We'll be back after a quick commercial break. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. So I received a lot of emails from listeners and former students, and they're asking me, what's going on in Iran? Are there predictable outcomes in Iran? But most importantly, a lot of people are asking, why should Iran matter to the United States? And I'm sure a lot of you asked that question because what you're really asking is whether this is some distant, abstract problem. A lot of you do not want to get into another foreign entanglement, especially when it comes to the Middle East. Our track record has been terrible, but we have to understand that Iran isn't some theoretical threat that exists out there. It's not just a future concern because The fact of the matter is Americans have already paid for the current Iranian regime in blood, and you don't have to speculate about this. You don't have to speculate about Iranian hostility toward the United States. All you have to do is look at history and remember. Think about how as soon as the Ayatollah came into power, 52 Americans were held captive for 444 days. Think about how in 1983, Iranian-backed Hezbollah carried out the Marine barracks bombing. 240 American servicemen killed in their sleep. In 1996, you had Khobar Towers, 19 Americans, U.S. Air Force personnel killed, hundreds wounded. Iraq, you look at all the Iranian-made IEDs. Now, you can make the argument that we should have never went into Iraq in the first place, but that's neither here or there. We went in. We have to deal with reality. We have to deal with the reality that 17% of American deaths in Iraq came from Iranian-made IEDs. How many thousands of Americans sustained life-altering injuries? I'm talking about missing limbs, traumatic brain injuries, lives permanently changed at the hands of Iranian-made IEDs and the unrest they were trying to foment there. So let that sink in. Those weren't accidents. And people tend to forget, but the Islamic Republic of Iran is not just a hostile government with bad policies. This is a regime that has systematically used proxy violence as an instrument of state power. This is a regime that understands that terrorism is not a side effect, that terrorism is a tool to be used. See, Iran's leadership, they made the conscious decision decades ago that attacking Americans indirectly through its proxies, its militias, deniable operations, was far safer than confronting us directly. And they weren't wrong. I mean, it obviously worked. But ask yourself this. How many regimes can claim responsibility for killing thousands of Americans without ever paying a decisive price? How many out there? That's not a regional nuisance. Iran is a hostile nation. The Ayatollah and his regime are hostile. They are a strategic adversary. They have a deliberate strategy. So when someone says, why does Iran matter to us? The real question is, how much more proof do we need that this regime defines itself, its identity, based in opposition to the United States? And here's where nuance matters, because you have lazy analysts out there, and lazy analysis ultimately falls apart. The Iranian people, I understand this culture very much, not just from my thesis, but actually knowing Iranians, speaking to them, understanding them, studying their history. And when we look at it, culturally, historically, socially, Iran actually has deep Western influences. We're talking education, art, literature, entrepreneurship. There's a reason that Iranian immigrants that come to the United States have been some of the most successful, educated, pro-American communities anywhere. Many Iranians do not want an endless confrontation with the United States. They want to live normal lives. They want economic opportunities. They want the ability to travel freely. They want prosperity. Most importantly, they want to be treated with dignity, something that the current regime has stolen from them for 4 to 5 decades. Okay? They don't chant death to America. The regime does. And to the regime, that's not a slogan. That's actually the government policy. So Iranian hostility toward the United States is ideological. It's the regime. It's the product of a revolutionary theocracy that requires an external enemy so that it could justify its internal repression. That's why any type of normalization terrifies the regime. That's why any type of modernization terrifies the regime. Because the regime knows that a prosperous, connected Iran doesn't need clerical rules steeped in Shia Islam. And I want you to ask yourself, because I think it's worth asking. If the Iranian people are not inherently anti-American, if they want normal relations, and if this regime has spent decades killing Americans by proxy, who exactly benefits from pretending Iran is just someone else's problem? Who? The Iranian people didn't kill Americans. The Islamic Republic did. It's the foundation of any serious policy discussion we have, and it brings us to the bigger picture, because this regime does not operate in a vacuum. We have to look at the geopolitical implications of what happens in Tehran, because it doesn't just affect Iranians. It doesn't just affect Americans. What happens in Iran will reshape the entire global balance of power. We're talking Russia, China, the future of the Middle East. And that's what I want to focus on in the next segment. So hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. All right, so we need to get to the geopolitical implications of Iran because the stakes are enormous. At the end of the last segment, I explained Iran doesn't exist in isolation. And what's happening in Tehran isn't just a domestic uprising. It's not just a human rights crisis. It's a stress test for the entire anti-Western power structure that's been forming over the last 2 decades that many of our political leaders have completely ignored. And here's a question I want you to keep in mind as I walk you through this segment. What happens to Russia and China if Iran, their most reliable Middle Eastern partner, becomes unstable or, even more to the point, collapses? See, Iran is not just a regional player. Iran is a keystone state. It connects Russia to the Middle East. It connects China to energy security. It has proxy networks across Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Yemen. Pull Iran out of the equation, weaken Iran significantly, and the pressure begins to ripple outward. It doesn't just stay within Iran. This is why Iran matters far beyond its borders, and this is why authoritarian regimes tend to support each other. It's not out of friendship. It's not out of mutual ideals. It's out of necessity to blunt our power and influence here in America. So to really understand why Iran matters, you have to stop thinking in terms of individual countries. You have to start thinking in terms of an axis of power. For years, an anti-American axis has been forming. There's a formal structure to it. They're strategically aligned. The axis I'm talking about, China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and to a lesser degree, but still important, is Brazil under the Lula regime. You have different systems, different cultures, different ambitions. They're not politically in sync with each other, but they're united by one thing. They're united in their opposition to American power and influence around the world. Why do these regimes keep finding themselves on the same side of global disputes? Why do they constantly support each other diplomatically, and why do they trade energy, weapons, and evade sanctions together? It's not a coincidence. That's the alignment right there. See, the Axis, they have agreements on hand, but it doesn't need a charter or a flag. It operates on shared incentives, and the incentives are to weaken the United States, undermine Western norms, insulate authoritarian power in these countries. And I want to start with Russia because Russia's influence in the Middle East has taken a devastating blow in recent years. It's on life support. For years, Syria was Moscow's anchor. But with the fall of Assad, they lost that. Iran is literally the last man standing for Putin in the region. Without Iran, Russia is essentially evicted from the Middle East. So understand that. And understand that it was Russia that helped build Iran's nuclear program. Russia, who helped build Iran's advanced air defense systems. Russia, who provided Iran with satellite support. And what does Russia get in return? Well, arms flows. Iran has transferred an enormous amount of military equipment to Russia. We're talking rocket-propelled grenades, anti-tank missiles, drones, artillery. This is a two-way street. The defense pact that Russia and Iran have helps both countries, and they both circumvent the sanctions that we slapped on them. So what happens to Russia's position in the Middle East if Iran can no longer project power because it's fighting for survival at home? Well, Russia will face a major, and you can't underestimate this, they will face a major strategic setback. First off, its power and influence in the Middle East is essentially gone. Why? Because President Trump effectively moved countries like Saudi Arabia and others firmly into our sphere of influence. Then Russia also loses a major pipeline for the weaponry that they rely on in their war in Ukraine. All of this would end up turning Russia from a global power to a regional power that's isolated to Eurasia. This isn't theoretical. So when people ask, why should we care about what happens in Iran? The blunt answer is because Russia cares dramatically about what happens in Iran. Then we look at China. China's relationship with Iran, it's much different than Russia's. China is not an ideologically driven country on the world stage. They're not ideologically committed to Iran the way Iran is committed to opposing the West. China is a pragmatic country, effectively Beijing is the world's biggest opportunist. They don't care who is in charge in Iran. As long as they could have a relationship, as long as they keep the oil flowing with Iran, that's what makes Beijing happy. Beijing needs stable energy supplies. Beijing needs alternative trade routes. They want to create leverage against American influence. And with the Ayatollah in power, China gets that. They buy Iranian oil at hugely discounted prices, and they circumvent the sanctions that we placed on them. They invest in Iranian infrastructure, not because they want to help the Iranians, but it strengthens China's presence. It's the Belt and Road Initiative. The more money, the more infrastructure that China controls, the more power China has. China sees Tehran as useful. That's why they want a stable Iran. They don't want an Iran with unrest and a potential revolution brewing. China doesn't want chaos. They don't want an outcome that limits their oil flows, that threatens their investments. See, there are three things that China worries about when it comes to the collapse of Iran. First, obviously, the energy flows. China is the largest trading partner with Iran, and if oil is limited, China is going to see an immediate supply shortage. Second, if you no longer have a hostile regime in Iran, what does that allow America to do? Think about how that frees up an enormous amount of intelligence and military assets that we could push in the Indo-Pacific region, which is the main thing that China doesn't want. But most importantly, it harms China's eastward pivot. That's the most important. If a pro-American Iranian government emerges, that is going to strengthen America. It's going to box China out. For the last 3 decades, China has slowly and aggressively been trying to end the unipolar world order led by the United States. And if the Iranian regime collapses, the United States is going to be able to do a complete pivot to Asia because the Middle East will be firmly in our sphere of influence. And I want to make it clear, it doesn't mean that China is not going to be able to work with the new Iranian government, even if it's a pro-American Iranian government. But it's going to weaken China's influence on the world stage. When we combine what's going on in Iran with the loss of Maduro in Venezuela, the entire anti-American axis is taking a significant blow. China and Russia relied heavily on these regimes as critical pillars to the axis. And this would make the United States the unchallenged dominant power in the energy markets. And the truth is, the United States has been losing power and influence since 2005. There's no doubt about it. We could measure power, and we could see that power is a zero-sum game. In order for other countries to gain power and influence, you have to have countries losing power and influence. So as China and Russia and Iran became more aggressive, why? Because of the void that it was leaving behind as we were bleeding power and influence throughout the world. There were geopolitical shifts taking place, and we were trending on moving into a bipolar, even a multipolar world order. If we stabilize Venezuela, if Iran becomes stabilized, you have functioning governments that are friendly to the United States based on a shared interest of prosperity for their people and our interests. This will go beyond the unipolar world order that existed following the collapse of the Soviet Union. I don't think people realize this, but for years, the U.S. dollar has been weakened by the insane spending, the unsustainable debt levels that idiots in our Congress have been racking up. It's why the BRIC nations, particularly Brazil and Lula, they want to see an end to the dollar as the world's currency. If we dominate the energy markets, this push away from the dollar is going to effectively be over because the United States is going to have unprecedented control over the global economy. It's going to take the petrodollar to new levels. It will crush efforts to trade oil and other currencies. Now, step back even further. You have Iran that exports chaos. What has been happening in the Middle East since Trump came back into office? His first trip was over to the Middle East, and it's moving in the opposite direction than it was under President Biden. Remember, President Biden actually pushed Middle Eastern countries toward China. Look at how he treated Saudi Arabia and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Now, I'm not saying MBS is a great guy. He's a brutal leader. These are the leaders you have to deal with in this part of the world. But Biden, trying to act in his holier-than-thou foreign policy, a lot of Americans are like this, he actually pushed Middle Eastern countries toward China. Trump ended that. One of the first things he said is, however you govern your countries internally, that's what you want to do. We're not going to sit here. We're not going to try that democratization effort. We're not going to tell you how, your thousands of years of culture should be changed. And President Trump has invested a significant amount of political capital in trying to create a stable Middle East. The Arab states have responded. The Arab states are choosing economic growth. They're choosing modernization over ideology. I mean, just look at how the United Arab Emirates has banned its people from attending several universities in the United Kingdom because they're worried their people will be radicalized in those universities. Not radicalized what Western thought, that those students will become Islamic radicals. Think about that. It's mind-blowing. I never thought I'd be able to say on this podcast that the United Arab Emirates is worried about sending its kids, its young adults to foreign universities in a European country, the United Kingdom, over fears of Islamic radicalization. That's mind-blowing to me. But we're also seeing that a number of these countries, they're buying into this idea of stability. And you have to look at where the capital is flowing. Where is the money flowing? Look at who is investing in the United States. So what does the Middle East look like if the single most aggressive exporter of chaos, Iran, is no longer able to or willing to play that role? It may not be perfect. Okay, the Middle East certainly isn't going to become a democratic utopia, but it will be measurably more stable, and that matters. Iran is under internal pressure. You have Russia, who's currently overstretched, particularly in Ukraine. China, they're exposed. They're being cautious. The Middle East is recalibrating. Those conditions don't come around often. That's the perfect storm. And it raises the hardest question of this episode, the question that you have all been waiting for. If pressure on Iran weakens Russia, if it complicates China's strategy, if it reduces regional instability, if it's beneficial to the United States, then what should the United States actually do? What should we do? That's the million-dollar question. And we can't fall victim to the same mentality that has led us from one foreign policy disaster to another. Everything I said in this segment sounds great. But you have to understand, we have to play this right. We have no room for error. We cannot get this wrong, because if we get it wrong, it could be catastrophic. And every time something like this happens, we're told that the same two options exist, that there's only two options. There's either military intervention or complete disengagement with a wait-and-see approach. But is it really that binary? Because if I look at history, it tells us those are false choices, and false choices are how great powers make really stupid decisions. And so in the next segment, I'm going to tackle the hardest part of the conversation. Is it really war or nothing? Or is there a third path, a path that advances our interests without repeating the mistakes of the past? That's where I want to go next. So hang tight and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. So we have covered a lot so far in this episode. I would appreciate it if you would share this episode with 3 to 4 other people, because you're not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. And Iran is such an important issue, and Americans need to understand why it's important, because the stakes couldn't be higher. As I said in the last segment, you have too many people here in the United States that they love to oversimplify things. They love to make it as if we face a binary choice. We either intervene kinetically through our military or we do nothing. And I understand both those reactions, but again, it's a simplistic way of thinking. It shows we're not real critical thinkers anymore, because this type of thinking has done enormous damage to the United States over the last 25 years, at the least. So we have to approach this honestly. Listen, I get the war fatigue is real. I get it. I understand it. It's justified, especially given what happened in Afghanistan, where after 20 years of war, trillions of dollars spent, thousands of lives lost, the Taliban is better armed and equipped today than they were on September 10th, 2001. We are tired. We're tired of endless deployments. We're tired of the nation-building fantasies. We're tired of the so-called foreign policy experts telling us that it's all going to work out, that we're greeted as liberators. We're tired of what they have been selling us. I'm tired of the lack of any real strategic objectives, promises that never come to fruition. And we cannot ignore that this is a very big reason President Trump was elected in the first place. He campaigned on no new wars. He campaigned on no endless wars. He campaigned on no nation building. He campaigned on no blank checks for foreign conflicts. Those promises matter, and skepticism over foreign policy entanglements, it's not weakness. It's not anti-American. It's healthy to have this debate in a free society. But we see the tensions that are being created. Listen, we know anything the president does, the left and the Democrats are ultimately going to despise it. They're going to say that he shouldn't be doing it. They're going to find something wrong with it. But the direction we take in Iran is causing a split within the MAGA movement itself, within the America First movement. You have some Trump supporters that are going to support the president no matter what he does. They'll justify it. They're going to support him. It doesn't matter. But you also have a lot of Trump supporters saying that they didn't sign up for this. They didn't vote for Maduro being taken out. They didn't vote for taking out the Ayatollah and his regime. And I get why when I say Iran matters that some Americans recoil in horror. It's not because of ignorance. It's because of the memory. It wasn't too long ago. Iraq, Afghanistan, numerous areas, Libya, all disastrous outcomes. They remember all the lies they were sold. They know that those outcomes cost real human lives, American lives. But I think that a real question, a question that rarely gets asked, is does rejecting another war, particularly in a Middle Eastern country, does that require us to pretend that then there's nothing else that we could do? Because ultimately, that logic is a trap. I mean, we're constantly presented with a false choice. Invade and bomb, occupy the area, or do nothing and let it play out. Now, that logic has failed us over and over again. And the choice is not invasion and kinetic military action or indifference. There is a third path. We have to understand how power actually works inside authoritarian systems. Because authoritarian regimes, they survive on three things: command, control, and compliance. Not popularity, not elections, not consent. Those things are irrelevant. It's all about fear, coordination, and obedience. So how do you make the repression stop working? And this is where there is a third path. You start by breaking that cohesion that holds the regime together. At the beginning of the episode, I explained how we haven't seen any high-level officials defect and renounce the regime. That is a key indicator of whether a government is likely to collapse. That is what is worrying me right now, that we haven't seen that. And I should only hope that the administration is competent enough that they're paying attention to that too. Because right now, we should be applying enormous pressure on ambassadors, diplomats, IRGC commanders, other elites within the regime, the ones that support the regime. We have to create incentives. We have to maximize the pressure on them so that they defect. How do we do this? Well, we have to offer protection, off-ramps for those officials who decide that they're going to break ranks and speak out against the Ayatollah. If it's necessary, we have to bribe them, maybe even threaten them, that when the regime collapses, if they don't defect now, when the regime collapses, because sooner or later it will collapse, they're going to be targeted. See, you have to make it that if they continually maintain their loyalty to the Ayatollah, that's the most dangerous life decision they're ever going to make. You have to give them a reason to defect. And when elites and top officials, when they see their money isn't safe, when they see they're not safe traveling, when they see that their travel is limited, that their future and their family's future depend on distance from the regime, well, that's when you're going to begin to see that loyalty to the Ayatollah erode. And history has proven that this is one of the most effective ways to collapse a regime. Once the loyalty erodes, once you make it a risk versus reward, and the risk of supporting the Ayatollah outweighs any reward you could get from the Ayatollah, that's when defections will begin. And once a few high-level defections happen, I will guarantee you it will open the floodgates. So hopefully, behind the scenes, the Trump administration is trying to apply enormous pressure to top Iranian officials to say, I'm done with this regime. Then you have to target the regime's ability that allows it to repress its own people. And I'm not talking about invasion. I'm not talking about dropping bombs. I'm talking about degrading their surveillance capabilities. I'm talking about disrupting the censorship and monitoring networks that exist. Make it harder for the regime to hunt and track and silence dissent. At the same time, you do the opposite for the people. You keep Iranians connected to the outside world. You preserve the information flow that the Iranian government has tried to shut down. You deny the regime darkness. Authoritarianism will thrive in isolation. They'll maintain their power in isolation. Now, we certainly have the technology to do this. We can easily shut down their surveillance systems and the tech they use to censor their own people. We could put enormous pressure on any third-party suppliers. We could disrupt their satellites. We could disrupt their communications. At the same time, we could allow ordinary Americans to keep the movement going, keep the flow of information alive for the outside world to see. Because if you make the military and security services deaf, dumb, and blind, authoritarian control is going to weaken. Understand, the Iranian regime has intensified its military-grade signal jamming for Starlink. Elon Musk is trying to get Starlink to the people. We shouldn't just be hoping that they could stay connected. We should be using every one of our cyber capabilities to actively hunt and neutralize the jamming stations that are keeping 85 million people in the dark. Finally, the last step is you go after the money. Money matters. And we're getting reports that top Iranian officials have begun to send money out of their country. That means they're worried. When the rats start moving their money into Swiss or Emirati bank accounts, they know that the Ayatollah's grip on power is weakening. And what they're doing is they're hedging their bets. We shouldn't just sit by and watch them do it. We should be ready to freeze those assets. The moment they touch the global financial system, the moment they're moved out of Iran, we should freeze those assets, and we should do it surgically. Target the assets of the elites. Target their bank accounts. Target the slush funds, the vacation homes in other countries. Take control of every aspect of their lives when it comes to their economic situation. You take control of the money, you effectively end their lifeline. Now, the approach I'm talking about, does it carry risk? And the answer is yes. But so does doing nothing. And so does dropping bombs. It always carries risk. How much risk are you willing to take? And there's a difference between kinetic escalation, doing nothing, and deliberate pressure on the regime system. This is not to say that military action is completely off the table. You always keep your options open. And I understand that we only have a limited window of time here, that sooner or later the size of the protests are going to dwindle. You have the Iranian military and security services. They're going around brutal crackdown. Sitting on the sidelines isn't an option. But we have to be smart here, and we have to get it right. Iran is not just another crisis. Iran is a test case, a test of whether the United States can exercise strategic restraint and at the same time maintain our moral clarity, compete in a world that's defined less by wars of conquest, more by wars of influence. Because what happens in Tehran is not going to stay in Tehran. It will reshape the balance of power. It will determine the future outcome of this anti-American axis that exists. It's going to determine the rules of the global power system. And getting this wrong will be a disaster for the United States. Getting it right, that's going to help shape what comes next. And another generation doesn't have to pay the price. That's the choice in front of us. Now, I hope you found this episode informative. And if you did, please leave the P.A.S. Report podcast a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Take 30 seconds to write us a good review. That's it for today. Thanks for listening to the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.